in 1924. My name is Lori Woods. I know most of your faces, but not all. I've served as a council member here in Signal Hill. I've served you as a council member since March of 2013. So I'm coming up on 11 years. And it's my privilege to this year serve my third term as mayor, and definitely during the centennial, so I'm very excited. This evening, this is the second of several events like this that will happen monthly for highlighting the history of Signal Hill by decade. I guess I really have to keep this close, don't I? Okay. So, without further ado, I wanted to make a formal introduction to our presenter this evening, a researcher, the person that put all of this together and spent the time and effort to research this particular decade for Signal Hill. I wanted to take the time again to personally introduce David Ferrari, our historian, who is not only a passion for American history, but specifically Signal Hill's history. Originally from Englewood Cliffs, New Jersey, he received his Bachelor's of Arts in American History from Rutgers University. At Rutgers, he volunteered at the Palisades Park Historical Society, where he led a team to research a grave site that dated back to the early 1800s. David also went to St. Louis for a summer to work on research on the Lewis and Clark for his senior thesis. In 2005, David moved to Hershey, Pennsylvania, where he worked at the Middleton Public Library as a library assistant and volunteered for the Middletown Historical Society and as a member of the Middletown Historical Society. David later moved out west to Long Beach and started volunteering at the Rancho Los Cerritos Museum in Long Beach. It was here where David learned how to put exhibits together, started researching the Bixby family and the early history of Long Beach. And in 2016, David began working at the Signal Hill Public Library and became intrigued with the history of Signal Hill. He began to do his research on the Signal Hill history. And in 2021, David received his master's in public history from American Public University. David is now helping to put together the exhibits, the one you'll see in the history room tonight and throughout the year, as well as doing the monthly history talks to commemorate the city's centennial anniversary. David is also part of the Signal Hill Historical Society, where he serves as vice president. He's currently doing research on Jessie Nelson, our first mayor for Signal Hill, female, and to author a book about her life in the future. So help me welcome David. Again, most of you know him, but he represents it.
Well, thank you everybody for coming tonight, and I'm so happy to be here. So tonight we are going to be talking about the 1920s. So I want everybody to do a small little exercise. So as you see this picture of early 1900s Signal Hill, close your eyes now, envision a world that has farmers growing cucumbers, watermelons, and flowers that covered the slopes of Signal Hill. Imagine a place where it would feel like the Mediterranean, with some palm trees, clear skies, warm days, and beautiful views of the ocean and of Catalina Island to the south, and beautiful views of the mountains to the north. Imagine a world with beautiful homes that covered the hills, and just feeling free, and where residents came here to enjoy life away from the cities. Now, let's travel to the 1920s, where everything has changed. Now open your eyes to the new world. Imagine a world with all the oil derricks working on drilling for oil, the air-approved There appeared to be always in a perpetual fog bank of steam from the myriad boilers which furnished the rigs. Imagine a world where the noise from these drillings could be heard from 5 miles away. Imagine a world with huge fires and explosions that could be heard and seen for miles, where the only things that was growing were oil derricks instead of those cucumbers and watermelons. Welcome to Signal Hill in the 1920s. Now, before we discovered the oil in 1921, oil was kind of discovered in 1916 with the Union Oil Company of California. This oil company leased land just west of Signal Hill by the corner of Wardlow and Long Beach Boulevard. The Union Oil Company drilled down to 3,449 feet, and then it just stopped short of tapping into an oil reserve. However, shortly after, they just packed up and left because they were discouraged that they actually did not find the oil they were looking for. So, in November 1920, in Bolsa Chica, they started producing 20,000 barrels a day at a feet of 2,549. So because of the Bolsa Chica discovery, the oil geologists focused their attention on the chains of the topographic highs. The geologist was speculating that the oil was accumulating under the structure of the Long Beach and Signal Hill area. So our first oil well that was discovered was on June 23rd, 1921, and it was Alameda's number 1. So the name of the foreman was Happy Owl and his crew. They worked through the night drilling for the black gold until they finally reached their accomplishments at 3,114 feet of a geyser that started coming out. The oil reached over 100 feet in the air, passed the wooden oil derricks, and lasted 4 days until they could cap the oil. The measurement of the oil coming out was at 1,200 barrels a day. So here we have a newspaper article from June 24th from Jessie Nelson. She actually wrote the article talking about the black fluid shoots high in the air at different times at night. Well, the sand's up. So, here we have a map of the Signal Hill oil fields that runs from northwest to southwest, about 5 miles long by 1 mile across. In the northwest, the field begins the junction of the San Diego Freeway, that's the 405, and the Long Beach Freeway, the 710, and roughly parallels the 405 freeway near the intersection of Lakewood Boulevard and the Pacific Coast Highway at the traffic circle. Portions of the field now extends into also Alameda's Heights area by Recreation Park and the Los Cerritos of Long Beach, though these areas are no longer productive anymore. So, as we see right there, this was all different years from 1921 to current days of where the production of Worley oil was. So, how do you build your own wooden oil derrick? Building an oil derrick was actually very easy. So the workers, or the roughnecks, would use dimensional lumber number 2 by 12-inch planks. Then the men would nail them together on the edge to make the corners. Then the men would work their way up to the sky, nailing cross pieces to keep the rigs stable and extending the corners as they went. The wooden derricks lasted for almost 10 years, and it gave rise to the steel derricks. However, most of the wooden oil derricks didn't last because there were lots of fires that took place in the 1920s. So they just built another oil derrick. So, in this, real estate agents in 1921 were profiting from the oil craze because there were so many people wanting to drill their own oil. Real estate agents would sell the same land to different prospectors. So, John Doe would come in and say, I want land by Temple and Hill. Okay, that's 20 bucks. They pay him, fills out the form as he leaves. The agent rips up the paper. Jane Doe comes in. I like to buy some land. Oh, we have a perfect land on Temple and Hill. Same thing, 20 bucks. Go in there. She takes it. She leaves, rips it up. And with this, you had interlocking oil derricks. And that's how we also got the Farms. So, the competition for the oil rights became so fierce that the homes were bought and torn down in a matter of months. There were so many wildcatters that came in and started building their own that it also was known as Porcupine Hill. And with this, we just grew and grew each year as we produced more oils. So, one of the with the real estate and the oil company coming in, they were making deals with the homeowners for these competitions to start drilling. So one of the homes that was affected by this production was the Lewis Denny's carriage house. And this was also the Henshaw's building from the early 1900s that we had talked about. George Hughes homes. So Denny built a new home. So with the oil company and through negotiations, he worked out a deal that they actually moved his home across the street, and then he received at least 50% of the royalties from the oil companies, from the oil rights that was extracted from his land. And with that, he became rich. And if we remember from our last month, Denny, the whole family were into the cheese factory business, and they just got even richer now with the productions of this. Other citizens in the area managed to get at least 20 to 33% in royalties, but he just waited and his time out for this. So now let's envision a world of fires in Signal Hill. So one of the first major fires was the Shell Oil Nessa fire, number 1. So the fire, it started around 1:30 a.m. and it was so bright that one could read a newspaper from downtown Long Beach. It was that bright. But people were so enthralled because it was black gold, and they were just enthralled with fires and stuff. So one of the oil workers commented, there was a gentleman watching the fire, smoking his cigarette, and he was only like 20 feet from the fire. And it's like, man, isn't this cool? And people were just like, wow, they've never seen this before. So, as I said, people were not afraid to stand next to it. So, some of the dangers of oil wells were, for the roughnecks, first they could fall off as they climb all the way to the top. They could fall off the oil derricks, and that has happened a lot. Get seriously wounded, or unfortunately they would perish. They would fall into fires or get oil burns and get seriously hurt from this, or actually die from their wounds. And remember, something like that, as you see the geyser going up, with that, the winds also carried it to whatever directions it was going. So with that, you don't hear any kind of stories and stuff, but people, their homes were burned down to the ground, and you just had to leave as fast as possible with the clothes on your back. And this is some of the things that was new to Signal City residents, that with the black gold comes the dangers. So another problem was, and again, there was nobody there to research this for them, but people got asthma, cancer, birth defects, some type of respiratory problems, and blood disorders. And they found all this research many years later. But it was still the excitement of, let's see what they're doing. And this didn't last in the 20s. It went to 30s, to 40s. In the 1950s, when we had the Hancock fire, there were people standing, watching the fires, and the Good Humor truck was right there, handing out ice cream to everybody. And that will come later on this year. We'll show that to you. Another way people were getting their royalties was from the oil derricks that were built close to the graves in the cemetery at Sunnyside. So, loved ones, so if Uncle Joe was buried and they wanted to build an oil derrick right next to it, they would find out who the owner is and strike a deal with you. So if they actually found, if oil was started to produce, your family would get royalties from Uncle Joe. So, now let's talk about Jesse Nelson. Jesse Nelson was one of the best from Signal Hill. She is actually called the mother of Signal Hill. Jessie was a woman of strong individuality. She was tactful, she was gracious in manner, and someone who had a sense of humor. She had the charm and the quiet dignity of a Southern lady who made peeling or wielding a gavel a nice, elegant process. So, in 1923, as the movement to annex the Signal Hill property to Long Beach gathered steam, Jesse Nelson and a group of Signal Hill residents decided to take some action to stop this. The one major issue was that the property owners and the residents could not afford to pay the higher property taxes. So, Jessie Nelson went to Long Beach City Council and she stood up and told the city councilman and said that there was no case, that there was a case for taxation without representation. We paid $20,000 to the county for a library tax, but we have no library. We paid the county road tax of 35 cents per $100 valuation, making a $140,000 road fund. We paid $500,000 to Long Beach, but we had no schools. To further her cause for Signal Hill to become its own city, Jessie Nelson and the Petroleum Midway Company worked for an incorporation. It showed that Jessie Nelson had leased her property for drilling rights to the company. On April 14th, 1924, the Signal Hill residents took an incorporation election to decide whether or not to become a city. And the results were in. 344 residents said yes, and 211 residents said no. Signal Hill became a city. So, one of the first places, the city, there were actually 3 different places where the Signal Hill city council members had their meetings. And the first one was at the Signal Hill Civic League. This is a women's group that had started around 1905 that went to mid-1930s. And with their first meeting, they elected Jessie Nelson as the first mayor. However, back then they were not called mayors, they were actually called the president of the trustees. And the members who were also elected were the members of the trustees of Signal Hill. So the first city seal, this is our first city seal, and on this it has spoiled derricks on the bottom. On top it has the Pala Mansion, and also right there is the Denny Hilltop Water Tower. And these were the major landmarks at the time. But the fourth symbol, we're not sure if it's a tree or perhaps an oil gusher right there. But, and there's a little hill right there. So, unfortunately, I do not have a picture of our second. So after Jessie Nelson, she retired after a year due to health reasons. Our second mayor, they changed it eventually to mayor now, was Arthur Pike. Unfortunately, we could not find a picture of him. But he was mayor for 7 months, and then he was taken out on a recall. Our third mayor is William Henshaw, who was in office from October 1925 to April of 1940.
Mm.
So this is our first city hall. So let me backtrack a second. Throughout 1924 into 1925, the meetings were actually held at William Henshaw's house in his basement. And his basement was located on Temple. So this is the Charles William Henshaw's building. So this was the city hall, this was where the library was at, and then he had a store selling deli goods like milk, soda, water, stuff for food. So this building went from 1926 to 1932. Then, we'll get to the 30s in a minute, but in 1932, Signal Hill bought the land of Jesse Nelson and built the current city hall we have now. So this is the picture that we have of inside the city hall. I always like to envision myself, if I was back in those times, just walking down the halls, taking care of your business and stuff of that. Okay, so moving on, I'm going to backtrack a second. Let's talk about Happy Yowl. So our main guy, he was the head driller. Happy Yowl right there, and this was his crew. So who is Happy Yowl? He is one of the most major characters in Signal Hill history. He wrote the true story that lasts until today, and he was kind of considered the spirit of Signal Hill. He was the first of those rolling, licking corps which wrote the real story of Signal Hill, a tale which was buried under the record of finance, wealth, and commercial activities, which the black gold of the hill produced the oil workers' tale, the story of men drillers, the roughnecks, the superintendents, and the operators. Happy Yowl was one of those head drillers for Shell Oil. He was responsible for Alamance No. 1, and then he went on to do the Andrews oil derrick, the Nessa oil derricks, and a whole list of different derricks that was built. So he was also responsible in shaping the mold and how people built those derricks. At first, he was the head driller, but he became so famous and well known, he then became the superintendent for Shell Oil Company. His job as a driller, working with oil, was very dangerous, but he knew his job very well. No matter what the situation, if it was good or if it was bad, he always had that smile, and that's how he got his name, Happy. When it came to drilling for oil, Happy always had that twinkle in his eyes and his smile, and it vibrated even more with the thought of drilling for oil and facing those challenges that come with it. If Yowl was dragged out of bed to meet the threat of a fire when a well broke loose, even when a well shows water in an unexpected manner, Yowl's eyes would just light up and always show the biggest smile. He did his work not for the money, but it was for the passion of dealing with oil derricks. He was a man who worked for years, and one day in one of the fires, a man who worked with him rushed up to him in the heat of the moment and asked him, "Why don't you scowl instead of grin? Because this is a treacherous moment we're having." Yowl's quick response was, "They can get this oil well, but they will never get my smile." So, in December of 1928, Superintendent Happy Yowl left the Shell Oil Company to be the General Field Superintendent for the newly formed Pacific Western Oil Company. Happy